Welcome to part two of the principles of design. We're heading into the next principle, which is called contrast. And now, in my opinion, this is, in all art forms, the absolute most important thing, a principle that any artist can use. Contrast in any number of options. You can rack off a million different, big, small, light, dark, color, black and white, strong, weak, stable, unstable, all of these things, fast, slow, calm, chaotic. Contrast is everything. So, the single most important principle in any form of art, that is my personal opinion. Contrast is the juxtaposition of very similar elements. Well, there's a big fat word. Juxtaposition. Basically, juxtaposition simply means the closeness of two things, their relationship in distance. So if you put something big against something small closely, or if you put them far apart, contrast begins to become more and more and more the closer you put the two contrasting things next to each other. So juxtaposition is simply a big fancy word for how close are they in whatever situation you could think of. Without contrast, visual experiences would be monotonous. So the time to list is, well, we're not in class, so moving on. So in this case, contrast in value. Obviously, extreme darks and extreme lights. Contrasting. The figure of Christ is completely backlit. The rest of the room is exceedingly dark. We have a little bit of contrast in the back edge there where Aeneas' wife is preparing dinner. So contrast in value, light versus dark. Again, contrast in value, light versus dark. Okay. Before any comic is colored, it starts as a pure black and white, high contrast image. Now, less so as we've moved on into the digital age of comics or illustration. But back in the day, these shadows and these black shapes, would create contrast. Again, contrast of light and dark. Extremely powerful light source, casting very deep, rich shadows. Very darkened forest, plant life. Really just extreme amounts of light versus dark. But not so dark that we can't still see his eyes. Now, contrast in color. Complementary colors clashing. Okay? So in this Van Gogh piece, which this is a much better slide than that one I showed you in the other elements presentation, the bright, saturated, really pure red-orange against this nearly sickening green and these extremely vibrant yellows. All of that contrasting color makes for a very visually dynamic, which just means there's a lot of visual back and forth happening in this piece. And that is almost solely based on Van Gogh's use of very intense, pure, out-of-the-tube colors. Again, more contrast in color. It's still complementary, warms versus cools. But they're more harmonious this time. And in this case, color is dictating lightness and darkness. Even though there's not really a light source here, the color is being used as light. So the reflection is cooler, darker, sadder colors. And then the woman on the left, is much more flesh pinks and vibrant mint greens and some rich reds. And then her background is much more red, orange, vibrant. And as we come across to the mirror, the background is yellows and greens, a little cooler, a little less vibrant. Okay? So color is being used as a contrasting element here. I once had a classmate who recreated this piece totally out of jelly beans, and it was amazing. Again, contrast in color. The FedEx logo, blue versus orange. These are complementary colors. It makes it pop. Then you have things like contrasted materials. So textures, things like that. So we have a marble, stone, triangle, pyramid, not a pyramid, but a triangle shape of stone, and then a glass vase, receptacle, and it's glass versus rock. You expect the glass to shatter, not warp and melt around it. Now, obviously, this piece was made while the glass was still at its melting point, and then they set it on the stone to cool, and as it did, it began to sag and droop over it because it was in its softened state. And then when it hardened, and we had very fragile glass impacting a rock but not breaking. So we have contrast in two different materials. Again, more contrast with materials and textures. This is the Royal Ontario Museum in Ontario, Canada, and they added an extension. And you can see on the left that the original museum was a very typical, very temple-based, iconic, stable stone structure where all the art was going to be housed, and it housed probably old ancient art and Renaissance art and things like that. And then when it was decided to add an extension to house its more contemporary art section, the architect Daniel Lipskind, that's probably right, took it to the extreme, not only using lots of steel, aluminum, and glass, but also making it this tilted, jagged, pointy, almost like a quartz crystal. So not only is the material completely different, but the form is completely different. We go from a very blocky, stable, old school stone building to suddenly this very modern, jagged, tilting, warping steel and glass construction. And it's actually kind of enveloping and eating part of the old museum, almost like a tumor. So we have the old and the new merging kind of together. It looks like one's consuming the other, but a very strong contrast in two different forms of materials. The old and the new. Contrast in materials and textures. What is expected versus what it is. So Klaus Oldenburg would do, throughout the 60s and early 70s, he did what was known as soft sculptures. Now, not only he would make objects that were normally made out of hard, rigid materials and make them with vinyl and fill them with like beanbag filling. So his light switch, his soft light switch, this saggy, droopy thing, you expect the light switch to be made out of rigid, formed plastic. He turns around and makes it more out of a furniture filling. And so what's expected versus what it's made out of. Believe it or not, the two switches do flip on and off on this one. They don't just sit in the off position. Of course, the weight of the filling sags them down.